Y'all. Welcome. I'm Rebby. My pronouns are they, them, and theirs, and I'm with Equality in North Carolina. Today, we're talking all about how to support queer and trans youth in schools, not only in the classroom, but beyond. Today's agenda will take us through more about the organization that I am here with, as well as some school climate pieces and all of the information that you need to put in best practice in the roles that you play. We'll have an activity on how to support folks when they come out, and then I'll leave plenty of time for discussions and questions, which you can utilize the chat box while we're here together today, so I can work those in as well. So a little bit more about Equality North Carolina. I'm the Director of Education Policy, and I play one aspect of many roles at the organization. We've been doing this work for North Carolina for over 40 years, particularly serving equitable rights for queer folks, youth, adults, and the like, and building a safer, more equitable space for all of our North Carolinians, particularly working at the margins until the margins become the center. It's an honor to do this work at the intersection of youth education, and I'm excited to share with you more about what I'm up to in the world and what you can do to create safer spaces as well. The one question I get asked the most is, what is LGBTQ? Not only from an aspect of identity, gender identity, and sexual orientation, not only from the perspective of what do the letters mean and why do we have so many acronyms, but specifically about what it is that we're talking about anytime that we talk about queer and trans identities. The great thing is that everybody has sexual orientation and everybody has gender identity, but our own understanding of gender expands over time, and it depends on where we grew up, the cultures that we were exposed to, what our families have instilled in us, but also the norms that we might be boxed into. Some of those norms can deeply impact the way that we relate to one another. Y'all, I grew up knowing that women had certain roles and that there's always going to be a glass ceiling to work through. Right? I had a very strong concept that a lot of men got to wear suits to work and make a lot of money. And so a lot of this work is more than just understanding what the acronym stands for, but more about understanding what we can do collectively to help break through some of these norms so that we can understand everybody, how they show up, and give up some of those old assumptions. The Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network has put some of these concepts together in a graphic that I have found a bit more understandable, especially for the visual learners in the room. So you'll see at the top of our little triangle here, gender attribution. That's a lot of what I was just referring to. The roles that we're expected to play because of our gender, how society perceives us, and what happens culturally if we break some of those assumptions or attributions. Our gender expression is something that people see first of us. When we meet somebody, we might recognize their hairstyle, the kind of glasses that they're wearing, makeup or no makeup, clothing, mannerisms, all sorts of pieces where we express ourselves out to the world. Our young folks are making decisions about this every single day. And sometimes what people see isn't exactly what folks want them to see. So sometimes there's a bit of a break here between the two, and I'll unpack more about that here in just a moment. Something that people don't always see at first glance is what your sex assigned at birth is. Sure, we have some basic sex characteristics between facial hair, height, and all sorts of things that often help the medical community split us into two in the society that we know. But gender identity is so much more than any of these three aspects of who we are. Our gender identity is how we understand ourselves to be, the language that we use to describe ourselves, whether that's man, woman, non-binary, transgender, genderqueer, agender, the list goes on. I'll share more about that as well. But you'll notice that gender identity is seated at the very center of the triangle because it's internal. I wouldn't know your gender identity unless you said so. even though I might have visual interpretation of who you are or what your interests might be, I might not ever know what pronouns you use unless I ask. So this graphic kind of helps us understand a little bit deeper about how we can break beyond what it is that we see with our eyes and dive a little bit deeper. But to actually get into the acronym, I want to offer a few different buckets. If you've heard of the term SOGI, you might already be familiar with some of these buckets. Sexual orientation, which is the SO, gender identity, GI, and gender expression, expression E added to the end. And so each of these three buckets talk about who we love, sexual orientation, gender identity, who we know ourselves to be, and our gender expression, how we express ourselves out to the world. And so most folks that come into this session might be super familiar with the terms lesbian, gay, bisexual, maybe pansexual, some asexual, straight, and queer as a positive reclaimed term across the board. But I want to spend a couple minutes talking about gender identity, where most of the questions I receive land here. Aside from who we love, we know who we are to be. And the language that we might use to describe that could be transgender or cisgender or gender nonconforming as an umbrella term. So I want to unpack cisgender here for a moment, because typically this is the term that folks get really, really caught up on. The good thing is cisgender actually helps us widen the conversation. When I was growing up, people were either normal or transgender. But today, we can use terms like transgender and cisgender to bring all people into the conversation, regardless of your gender identity. So if transgender means somebody whose gender identity, who they know themselves to be, is different than their sex assigned at birth, then cisgender would be almost the inverse. Somebody whose gender identity is exclusively aligned to their sex assigned at birth or birth assignment. I could spend an hour unpacking those two terms alone. However, there's a ton more to get through. I'm happy to send out resources in advance. Allison knows how to get me on that. But again, these are some additional terms that might serve helpful for our conversation. Non-binary, gender nonconforming, and genderqueer are all large umbrella terms that essentially describe folks that might express and exist outside of the binary that most of us grew up with, man and woman. So a lot of white supremacy and racism that might fall into our interpretations of man and woman as well, because in fact, there are hundreds of gender diverse cultures across the world, not just our American perspective of man and woman. But again, there's a whole another decolonizing gender session that you can check me hopefully next year. But hopefully this is a good overview of terms. I have a couple more slides about terms, but if any questions are popping up so far, drop them in the chat and I'll be sure to check the chat before I move to the next section. Intersex is a term that often comes up here in space as the I in LGBTQIA, sometimes plus. Intersex broadly describes folks whose sex characteristics don't fit the medical industry's boxes of what it means to be male or female. This includes lots of different characteristics internally and externally, like hormones or genitalia, right? Some things like chromosomes that we couldn't always see, but some of those secondary sex traits that come out, like I mentioned, facial hair, body development, all of those pieces can be combined in a way that the medical industry doesn't always make room for. But people born intersex are about as common as people born with red hair or with green eyes. And so there's actually a lot of folks in our general population who are intersex or have intersex traits. Interact.org is an incredible organization to learn more. Because I am not an intersex person, I can never be an expert by any means on this topic. But we have come out of Olympic season, and there's a graphic here of a gold medalist from South Africa. Castor Semenya was actually outed as being intersex years ago, particularly because her testosterone levels were high based on what the medical industry names and the International Olympic Committee, what is the I in IOC, that they deemed of what would present doping or additional hormones. At any rate, it's worth looking up. You likely have worked with intersex young people, and not all intersex folks identify as LGBTQ or transgender, but some do. And another piece to consider for the folks, adults, staff, and otherwise, as well as students, is how we talk about transition. Now, likely you've come across a young person or an adult who might say, I'd like for you to use this name and this set of pronouns when you refer to me, even though you might have known that person for 18 years to have used one name that you've always known and one set of pronouns. But this is likely a reflection of their personal social transition, which can include things like names, pronouns, shifting gender expression through clothing or hair, and the broad coming out process, which we'll talk about in the second half of today's presentation. Now, social transitioning is going to be a primary tool that you'll witness while you're working with young people. It's rare that you'll be working directly with young folks who might be engaging in medical transitioning. And medical transitioning is not required for a young person to be trans. There's a lot of misconceptions in our state right now, especially following a ton of the anti-trans bills that came through our state and others that spewed a lot of misinformation about puberty blockers that young folks can use to pause puberty, as well as who gets to access hormone replacement therapy. It's definitely worth having a broad overview knowledge, but please know that there's not one surgery. Please know, if you wouldn't ask your grandmother a question about her body, please don't ask a trans person about their body either. Let's just stay out of that. It's none of our business. Yeah, I do want to pause here. My next portion is going to be about pronouns. And so thanks for the love, Christopher. Yeah, right, like basic respect, basic respect. Amazing. And thanks for folks that have introduced themselves in the chat. If you haven't done so yet, I would love to see you. I want to follow up with the person from Winston-Salem State. I have some connections for you I'd love to follow up with. Okay, so let's talk pronouns. Every single time I do this session or similar ones, people are like, okay, I want to get the pronouns down. So first and foremost, we all in this room use pronouns. Whether we know it or not, everybody refers to us when we're not around, maybe using language like she, maybe he, maybe they, or a combination of any of these. Trans people aren't the only one who use pronouns, and they're not preferred pronouns because they're just our pronouns. And so this is really important to keep in mind. So when a young person uses another set of pronouns, again, this goes back to the concept that they might be going through social transition, and there's an opportunity to provide more support. Based on some 2021 data from earlier this year, the Trevor Project revealed that a ton of non-binary young people are using a combination of pronouns beyond she and he. In the graphic to the right, we actually see that there is a ton of combinations here. That could be she or they, he or they, or they, them. For folks that you meet that might use multiple pronoun sets, it's a great time to ask them if they prefer a certain set of pronouns that day. Again, they're not preferred pronouns, but if somebody uses she and they pronouns, one day might feel better using she, her, when another might feel better using they, them. Just in the same way, you might not wear the same set of jeans every single day, but some days that pair of elastic jeans might feel really nice. Other days you want to wear sweatpants. It's kind of like that. Some things just feel better than others, and not to boil trans people down to sweatpants. I'm just saying. And so lots and lots of LGBTQ folks, particularly Gen Zers, a whole breed of energy that I'm still learning, can continue to teach us. There is a really great resource called Neo-Pronouns. Neo-pronouns, N-E-O pronouns, are a subset of pronouns that have been developed out from language, from culture, influenced by subculture, pop culture, that can broaden out how we refer to ourselves. There's a whole neo-pronouns Wikipedia that's actually fairly accurate. I would recommend checking that out. But we're seeing more young folks use pronouns that many of us have never heard and have no idea how to conjugate. But this is an example and a great time to name the book, What's Your Pronoun by Dennis Barron. He talks about English and Old English, gosh, from 1790 all the way to 2019. And there's pronouns in there that I'm like, I've never heard of that. And I've been reading for a long time in my life. So I'm always a student in this space and definitely worth checking out. But just this way you see it. The other one, Allison, I'll ask you to drop in the chat. So -18 has an app called the Pronouns app. It might take you a second to Google it. That's a great tool to practice using pronouns, because I don't even have all of these memorized. So let me also just set the bar there. But that tool helps me when I meet somebody who does use a set of pronouns that I'm not familiar with. So why are pronouns important, right? No matter where you fall on your understanding of trans identity, data shows that young people exhibit less signs of depression, anxiety, and suicidal thoughts when they're honored in space, when their names, their pronouns, and their identity are seen. This data was massively important to this work, and that was in 2018. This research is already 4 years old. But the University of Texas at Austin finally gave us some information to tell us why this matters, why our district and school policies matter, why all districts should be able to incorporate basic procedures like staff shall honor names and pronouns of students and staff on campus. Confidentiality is a whole nother piece of the conversation, and I can field some of those questions as they're relevant to your work. But just being able to see this, if this is true for our young folks, this is true for each other. And students are not the only ones coming out in our environments. Title IX protections have added SOGI identities, which means our workplaces are going to become more inclusive of these conversations as well. Okay, so before moving into the next section, I'm just going to check. Perfect. Yes, that's right, Allison. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, beautiful. So I'm going to pause here and see if there are any questions. You're welcome to come off of mute, as scary as that feels sometimes. Are there any questions, any points of clarification, any additions? I'm not the end all be all of this information either.
Hey, this is Danny here. I'm in Cabarrus County. I have a quick question for you. At the beginning, I heard you say LGBTQIA and sometimes plus, and maybe you're going to get into this, but I was curious why you said sometimes plus. Sometimes.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so the sometimes is that based on your region, based on where you are, based on the article you're reading or the book that's been published, the queer community is reflected in so many ways. LGBTQ, LGBTQIA, LGBTQIA+, 2S to include Two-Spirit in there, and the proverbial Tumblr acronym of Quilt Bagpipe, which includes every single identity that you can imagine. And even that's now outdated, rest in peace, Tumblr. And so there's really nothing major to take away from that, except there's no wrong way to describe it as long as you're honoring respect, and that you're likely going to see queer and trans folks represented in data and curriculum in a variety of ways. But yet what it all boils down to is that we're talking about SOGI identities, sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. Yeah, great question, Danny. Awesome. Okay, well, listen, interrupt me at any time. I love to hear your voices as well. For the next portion here, I do want to talk about school climate. And you all know best because you're on the ground, you're doing this work. So as I move through this portion, think about some of those cases that you're working with, or some of the students that you've gotten to know, the family members, and even the staff that you've gotten to know. And think about how this data might ring true for the folks that you're working with. But first and foremost, I have a question for you that I would like you to use the chat box to respond. What do you think young people should be focused on most in school? What should students be focused on most in school? It's not a trick question. I'll keep an eye here on the chat. Cool. Shanika says schoolwork. Amazing. Yeah. Academics and classes. Samira says they should be focused on coursework. Morgan says education. Yeah. I'll wait here for a couple others. Growth from an educational standpoint, personal and mental. Olivia, finding and identifying interests and passions. Yes. Hobbies. What is it that you love to do? Another upvote here for academics and education. I think that they should be focused on whatever makes them happy. Absolutely. I think all of these are true, that every single young person, particularly our LGBTQ folks, should be focused on all of these things. Based on some data from the Human Rights Campaign, we actually have seen that LGBTQ young people are most focused on their non-accepting families or family rejection, bullying concerns, or any school-based problems, as well as the fear of being out. On October 11th, just earlier this week, was National Coming Out Day. Now, this makes me pretty nervous that just about 20% of young people are nervous to be out. And yet we have a national day, international, it's honored in Ireland, UK, and the Netherlands, as well as Switzerland, of what it means and looks like to come out, like a rite of passage. But sometimes it puts folks at risk. But you're right. Our straight, cisgender peers are focused on all of the things that you've named: education, academics, college, career, what comes next after school, and even the pressures that might come up from finding a job or going to college or trade school, anything that comes after high school. These are two very different lived experiences of young folks. I think this was some of the most sobering data that I saw that really got me to think about the barriers that exist for LGBTQ folks in school. So you'll see here, the HRC has then visualized this information where you can see how straight cisgender youth, as well as lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans youth, are having similar concerns in school, but you'll see that they're listed a little bit differently. The distribution falls a little bit differently. What happens when young people don't feel safe in the classroom, when they don't feel like their families see them or their educators see them, they're afraid to talk about who they are? They become disconnected. We saw this data show up specifically in COVID, where some families were even more rejecting of their kiddos during the stay-home orders, and our kiddos didn't have anywhere else to go from that point. Dr. Caitlin Ryan of the Family Acceptance Project actually does tremendous work here at the intersection of queer folks and family. Family support is everything, but sometimes when there's not a clear family support network, you or another educator might be the only person somebody has to turn to, especially in rural communities, and especially at the intersection of race. But when our queer folks are experiencing higher rates of the stigma and rejection, they're going to be more likely to cause harm to themselves. And unfortunately, our queer folks are 8 times more likely to have attempted suicide than their cisgender straight peers. Mental health is at the top of the tongue for so many folks, especially after the last 18 months that we've had. COVID isn't going anywhere, and folks are still feeling awfully isolated. And so there's a lot of intersections to consider here as well. I do want to pull some data out specific to transgender and non-binary folks based on the 2018 reflection of the GLSEN School Climate Survey. So this is 2019, that's a typo there. A large number of trans and gender non-conforming folks do not feel safe in the classroom, period. I'll speak to North Carolina here for a moment. In the last year, we have seen an anti-trans sport bill be proposed into legislation, a bill that would widen religious refusals for adults accessing basic things like healthcare, adult services, including retirement housing. The list was really, really deep, as well as a bill that specifically sought to ban trans healthcare broadly, social transition, medical transition for folks 18 and up. And to tell a community of adults what they can and cannot do is deeply troubling. Luckily, our state did not pass any of these 3 bills. However, we stand on the heels of House Bill 2. An element of House Bill 2 was creating conditions around access to facilities. If you're familiar with Gavin Grimm, he fought his case against his school district for equitable access to school facilities like bathrooms and locker rooms. He won his case, and then the Bostock ruling positively impacted Title IX, thus supporting Gavin Grimm's case more deeply. When we think about sex in Title IX, sex discrimination, we must think about sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. When our trans folks are harassed or bullied on school campus, they deserve equitable access to heal and resolve that conflict and that bullying. They deserve protections to be able to use their name and their pronouns in school settings, and an easeful way to be able to do that. Listen, I could spend 2 hours talking about Power School alone, but we take the chosen name field as a big win, but happy to support those cases and other gender support plans. I'll make sure my email is listed in the chat. But one thing I do want to name here that is often forgotten about is our dress code. A lot of dress codes in our state might still reflect girls must wear, girls can't wear, boys must wear, boys can't wear. What would our dress codes look like if it says students may not wear spaghetti strap tops? This helps break the bias that if I see somebody's perceived gender and that person might be wearing a skirt, but I think somebody of their gender shouldn't be wearing a skirt, that's my own bias I have to check. If the skirt's long enough, it covers what it needs to cover, any student should have access to that, right? So again, we have to think about what we've learned, what we've been conditioned to understand, and what we're willing to give up to make more space for young folks that we serve across the board. It's hard work, but it's also heart work. And that's why y'all have these roles. I know that that's why you're in this room. I want to pause here because I just covered a lot of information in a little bit of time. There's one more slide here that I want to leave you with before I hear questions. Over half of students are reporting that they hear homophobic remarks from the educators and trusted adults in their lives. And about 2/3 of students are hearing negative remarks about gender expression, specifically from educators. This is relative to North Carolina, it's relative to the nation. And I think that as we see conversations that are homophobic, transphobic, I could unpack what our elected officials are saying in the news as well. It impacts our kiddos. And so what does that say about their self-efficacy down the road? and how we're leaning into social workers and mental health professionals, school counselors, communities and schools to do some of this work as well. So I want to pause here before the next section. Are there any takeaways, any questions, any connections that you're making here?
And so I just want to, this is a comment / question. The previous slide where you had us, the question was, what should students be focused on in school? And I had a deep reaction to that because the word should, you know, so there's a perception there. But immediately my mind went to, what should the grownups be doing in the school? They're the responsible party. So per our response, if students are expected to do 1, 2, and 3, what should the grownups be doing in the school? A, B, C, and D.
What a phenomenal segue into the next section. It's as if you designed the slide deck with me. That's right. And that's absolutely right. And that is what we have to be considering. When you walk by a pond every day, maybe you walk your dog Fido along the road, and one day you notice that there's a fish that's gone belly up in the pond. I wonder what that fish ate. You know, that fish really shouldn't have been digging into the side of the pond. And we somehow blame that fish for doing something wrong. Next day, we're walking Fido and Fido's neighborhood friend. And this time we see 10 or 15 fish that have gone belly up in the pond. Well, they couldn't have all been, you know, eating that old food at the end. But they couldn't have all, well, what is going on that all of these fish are going belly up? So you start to consider, is there something in the water? Water being our climate, our culture, how we are treating one another. We eventually get down to it that if we walk by the next week and every fish in the pond has gone belly up, we have to consider the earth that is feeding nutrients into the water that is giving life into the fish. So you're absolutely right. We have to think about our policies, our structures, the culture that we're setting in place, the affect of our administrators. It makes a huge difference in creating this whole environment for folks. Policy and culture plays hand in hand together, and it takes both to make real change. And that's the whole purpose of this conversation. I've split this up into a few buckets. We'll talk about policy and procedure, which is sometimes tough. It can feel the hardest to make a difference in. We'll talk about culture, climate, and counseling services, LGBTQ inclusive materials and resources. We'll talk about coming out and do a little activity around that. This section is going to be structured a bit visually as a checklist, and I'll talk about some of the examples kind of as we go through. So if I'm losing you, let me know. We'll bring it back in. There's going to be a lot of information here. So to Christopher's point, what can we do? Okay. When a young person comes out to me as trans, I might say, thank you so much for sharing that with me. Have you told anybody else? That level of ask and information is going to help me build relationship and help me figure out what is it that I need to do to support the student the best. Now, oftentimes folks get nervous. Do I, as an educator, as a staffer, have the right to navigate this conversation? Do I have to call home and out this family? Is this person in counseling? Is this person thinking about hurting themselves? I get it. These adult brains, y'all, it just spirals out. I have to make sure it's not about me and put the needs back on that young person and take their lead. Gender support plans have been developed by an organization called Gender Spectrum. If you've never heard of them, it's just genderspectrum.org. They have updated their site a little bit, and they've created a template to have this conversation in a way where you bring trusted adults for this young person. You get involved at least one supportive admin on campus, whether that's an AP or a principal or somebody in the mix. And if there is family support, there's an option. However, I'll talk about family pieces here. I wonder, oh, I might have skipped those slides. I had some additional information here about family and a little video. If we have time, I'll show it. But the whole point is that if young people don't have supportive families, there might be an opportunity for us to pop in and play that role. And we do not want to out young people to their home supports if they are not ready. Right now, about 20% of young people in our juvenile detention centers and youth in custody care are LGBTQ, 20%. 80% of those young folks are BIPOC, Black, Brown, Indigenous, people of color. This tells a larger story, right, of what's happening at that level. We have to be able to fill that gap to keep folks out of the school to prison pipeline, bring them out of those pipelines that can take them closer into harm, and instead bring them into self-advocacy and develop those skills out. And so gender support plans are a small implementation that you can do where the student can guide you through things like the names and pronouns that they want to use in school, that they want to use when you call home, what facilities that they feel most comfortable in, how to navigate overnight trips, big question, especially for elementary school. And that's just that's one piece, okay? Young people deserve and have a federal right to access student organized clubs like gender and sexuality alliances. I do work across the state, and there are a lot of principals that are like, no, we're not doing that here. And I'll tell you what, if I walk in their office and I talk about policy, it doesn't go well. And then I get blacklisted for doing that work. People get really freaked out. But like literally, we have a Civil Rights Act that protects young people to organize on school campuses, where if there are clubs present, people can't actually legally tell the kids, no, you can't do it. But unfortunately, some of our cultures in our state do. So again, maybe an unpopular opinion, but you can tag me later. Knowing the connections that young people have to any family support or adults at home is going to be massive, massive, massive. We have to be willing to work with some of these families as well when possible. Now, that could be something like a family curriculum night where we actually introduce the inclusive lesson plans and books that students might have access to in the classroom. I'm tagging critical race theory in this as well, because our young people deserve to be having conversations realistically about race in the classroom as well. And our legislators are taking this in a whole nother direction. I don't know how far this recording is going to go out, but you know, I said what I said. And this is crucial, right? Because in the same way, I didn't have pictures of non-binary queer folks who were brown with mixed families in books. There were no families that looked like me or told my family story. There are 4 bloodlines in my sibling group, and I love that. But there were no books. There were no books like that. And so in the same way that we're providing this, we have to know that BIPOC queer folks have a completely different lived experience than our white queer folks and our white trans folks. It's real, and we have to consider it that way. So many of our school counselors are not inept on race topics. And that's challenging because, y'all, we need to have that. And we have to push for that professional development on campus, because like we see, we might be the only person that's intervening in the life of this young person. And if we can be just one, we can make a huge difference. And so access to queer affirming and BIPOC culturally informed counseling services and resources. And the last thing here, and definitely not least, are the staff on campus prepared to intervene in bias-based remarks. Election season is upon us, and this tends to be a big uptick. And when the news often trends on the isms side around class and gender and race and queer identity, Students are going to borrow some of this language, and are they prepared to intervene in a way that's educational and restorative? I have another slide here on restorative justice in just a moment. Actually, before moving here, I just want to pause because there's a ton of information. Hold on, let me backtrack. Okay. Are there any connections that y'all have made here and anything that you have put into practice in your schools along these terms, or anything that you would like more explanation or resource on? Likely this is review for y'all because y'all are doing the good work. Okay, I'm gonna keep going, but interrupt me at any time, please. You heard me talk about queer inclusive curriculum. I do want to talk about how this connects into sex ed as well. And I know that there are state given limitations on some of this work. I want to name that in our state, we have gone from an abstinence only approach, like many other Southern states, to a heteronormative until marriage approach, neither of which are LGBTQ or medically accurate. And so there have been public health professionals that I've worked with that do not understand that trans men can carry babies. People that have uteri are able to carry babies, right? And there's lots of levels to that. Our young folks aren't learning about trans inclusive reproductive health in school. They're not learning about LGBTQ inclusive sexual health, which means that there's often riskier behaviors because there's lack of access to those important barriers, right? When it comes to young people making decisions about their health, their bodies, and their relationships. So then when data typically pops up about risky sexual behaviors, it skews higher for LGBTQ folks. It does not mean that we stigmatize those folks on being over-sexualized. We actually have to name the conditions that these folks are making decisions in, because if they can't come out to their healthcare providers or their school nurses, then how are they going to be able to get STI barriers or the list goes on, right? Young people probably don't know what a dental dam is either, right? And this can be really important for two women engaging in sexual behaviors. And so all of these pieces play a role, but our schools aren't honoring that. So where can we build this work out and advocate for more access? And again, that's going to help. I mean, there's still sodomy laws on the books out and about in places, and like it's 2021 and our young folks need to be able to have this. And I share this as pieces of information that, again, you might already know and be aware of, but knowing that if a young person goes through their whole education career without being honored and reflected in any bit of school, that's where some of this negative data comes out of. So, pushing for our libraries and our classrooms to have diverse family representation. Are those families with two dads or two moms or blended households welcomed into family events and pastries for parents' nights? And how are we honoring local, regional, and national LGBTQ resources in the classroom and beyond? I do want to talk about coming out. So coming out is something that's deeply personal. And with National Coming Out Day as a national, international day of sharing who you are, there's pressure. Kids, young folks, and adults have so much pressure to just be out, just hurry up, do it, put your pronouns up, be out, do the thing. But every single person has a very different experience. We're coming out at home, coming out at school, coming out to peers, coming out at work are all going to mean different things. In our great state, it has historically been true that if you're outed to your employer on a Friday, you could be out of a job by Monday. If you're outed as trans to your landlord, you could be also out of a living situation, because there are no statewide protections for non-discrimination. So a lot of our young folks, when they graduate school, even having some basic level of protection from bullying and harassment, they're then getting tossed into an employment where they might be even further marginalized out of work and then right into pipelines of harm. So coming out might not be as easy as it seems for everybody. Coming out about sexual orientation is always going to be different than coming out about gender identity. And those will happen throughout your life. Every time I share my pronouns, I'm coming out. That's like literally every single day. And when we have people in our lives share who they are, we have to listen. And so how do we build and create responses that are grounded in respect, where we can create a brave space for conversation to ask how we might be able to support that person, giving up the stigma that somebody might not be whatever it means to be queer or LGBTQ. Like, we have to let go of what that means. But you don't look gay, but you've been dating somebody of a different gender, but your brother, right? And like, we make it about our understanding instead of just listening to their truth, right? So always getting out of our own adult brain and allowing the young person to guide us. With that being said, our elementary school staff are often under-equipped because there is this conversation that it's too early to talk about queer identity. But we have more LGBTQ characters in regular primetime TV, in Disney, in Illumination. What was the monsters or robots are taking over the world, and that main character was queer. Like, kids are ready. And I'll tell you what, 7-year-olds get on the pronoun train way easier than my 45-year-olds. It is just facts. And so they're ready to have these conversations. And trans kiddos know as early as ages 3 or 5 about gender identity. And so we have to give age appropriate responses. When somebody says that's so gay, we have to intervene. When somebody says my grandma thinks trans people don't exist, well, at this school, everyone's welcome and we're grounded in love and respect. And here's how this is going to go in this classroom. And so the way that we communicate to each other out in front of classes, one-on-one in our service, as well as how we communicate the culture of tolerance and respect as an organization with CIS, but also at the schools that we're serving. All of these pieces come together. Allison is going to get us set up here for some breakouts. And so what I would like for you to do is when you go into your pairs, the person whose birthday comes earlier in the year will play yourself in whatever role adjacent to an educator, adjacent to one-on-one worker with youth. And person B, the person whose birthday comes later in the year, will also role play a young person coming out. In this conversation, I'd love for you to come up. This is when we start losing participants. I get it, I understand. But I'd like for you to come on camera, come off of mute if you're able and it's safe to. When you go into your pairs, introduce yourself with your name and your pronouns and anything else. Allison will set the room up for 5 minutes, and I might extend that out to 6 so everybody has time to get set up. And so for the young person, pretend you're coming out as LGBTQ. If everybody has SOGI, you could also come out as straight if that feels more comfortable for you. Straight people can come out too, y'all. And so then how does person A, as the educator, share a warm, grounded, respectful offering? How do you build conversation with that person and ask them what they need? And so while you're in these groups, go back and forth, play out the role play as long as possible. It's going to feel awkward. There's going to be laughter. It's all good. When we come back together as a large group, we'll debrief a little bit about what it felt like, what came up. Yeah, any questions before Allison opens up the room for us? No.
5 minutes,
Okay.
right?
Yes, please.
Okay.
All right, y'all, we'll see you back here in just a moment. And Allison, I did not join the breakout. So if somebody is alone, let me know. I have one work thing for an event I have to field really quick.
No, you weren't supposed to, but I think in the meantime, I think I might have had a couple of people. I think it was all perfect. All right, I'm gonna move.
I'm just going to go off screen for a second. I'll be right back. Do we want to pause the recording?
Oh, thank you.
Recording. And I'd like to summarize a few things that folks have shared so far about their response in the role play. We heard about what it looked like to see authenticity reflect in the room, how we can honor one another and their own authenticity. We heard about the deep call to have professional development so that everybody on campus is ready to have these conversations, ready to unlearn a little bit and create a much wider space for community. And we also heard about what happens when we segment these conversations into communities that need it the most. When we see 20% of a student community at alternative schools who are LGBTQ or trans, that says something. That says big, big things, and that these students need this work so much. You all have brought up what it felt like to be in that conversation, not only to see that warmth from one another and from that educator, but also knowing that what's on the other side can be so much greater than what we've known. Even having one person in your corner can make a huge, huge difference. We have time for another share if you would like. I want to take a pause here as well. Sometimes the time is not right to respond in the moment. Maybe you're in the hallway, maybe you're at the bus line, maybe there are a million other things happening. Maybe, just maybe, you don't know what to say. It's okay to take a pause. That pause can look like, thank you for sharing this with me. This is new for me, but I want you to know that I care about you and I'll always be here for you. And that can keep us out of knowing, I don't know if I can keep my faith out of this conversation today. I don't know if I'm the right person for this young person to talk to. I don't know. It's okay to take a pause. And I want folks in this room to know that you are not required to be an LGBTQ advocate. I'm not expecting you to go down to the state house and push up against legislation. But what I am asking you, right, is to know a little bit more about this community, about the needs and this element of heart work that can create more space for all of our students. Noticing here too, just in the chat box, knowing that there was a wider conversation that happened at a local PFLAG meeting, and that it can be really, really deeply powerful to have authenticity and authority stem from the same Greek word, #fun fact. Thank you for naming that, Christopher. And considering what it feels like to have an assault on personhood within schools and school communities. That what does it look like to heal that? I promised more time, but there are about 4 minutes for kind of discussion here for any other thoughts and questions that you might have. We are a mighty group, so I just want to stop talking for a moment and see if there are any takeaways, anything else that you're leaving with today, or anything that has been unanswered.
So I just want to echo some of the sentiments offered earlier, that this is just dope, right? So that this is a conversation that needs to happen across the board with every affiliate, with every grown-up working with and for kids. But I do appreciate the individuals who opted to spend their time to learn a little bit more about how we can better support our students, all students, and recognizing that there are specific needs. So appreciate it. Also would like to offer this, that last exercise was really dope. And as someone who identifies as the G in LGBTQ, that had I had someone when I was elementary, middle, or high school, then the transition, my anxiety levels, thoughts of or suicide ideation, and all these other things would not have taken place, likely. Just to have a one somebody to hold a safe space. So I thank you all for leaning in and learning how you can offer a safe space for and be that one person for students. That's dope.
Now, I know better than to do these trainings without a box of tissues on my desk. And I just got a whole body experience from you, Christopher. Thank you for trusting us today and for being seen. And I see you and I honor you, and our kids need you. So thank you for being here and for being you. I also needed more folks like you in my life when I was a kid. Thank you. You're getting lots of love here in the chat and our reactions. So thank you. I think that's a beautiful place to wind us up. Allison has shared the session feedback. I 110% agree. If you want to see more of these conversations in your work, please include that in the feedback. My email address is rebby@equalitync.org. And I do these professional developments in elementary, middle, and high school. And it typically takes one room like this for somebody to say, there's one dope PD that we need to have on the list. And so while we have a lot of things to cover each year, this is definitely one to add to the list. Allison also let me know that she's going to take a quick look at the attendance list today and try to get some additional resources out, as well as the slide deck, if that serves helpful. To help make sure that happens, you're welcome to drop your email in the chat. The chat will not be distributed out and is not on the recording either, so your privacy is secure. Any other housekeeping, Allison, before folks move on to their next? This is the last session today.
This is the
No,
last
there's more.
for today.
Oh, it is. Okay.
Yes. And I would just echo, please complete the evaluation for Rebby. I was already texting with Shamika today and said, we need to bring Rebby back and give them a wider audience. I can't control everybody shows up, but the more that hear Rebby, the wider we can go with, we need to hear. And I know we've got at least one member of our DEI committee for CIS and C. I'm looking at you, Nicole.
Yeah.
On here today. So yes, I would say thank you. Please, give Rebby some love. Today is our last session. We start back bright and early for the last morning of our Impact Conference at 8:30. Yeah. So thank you all for being here.
Hey, Allison, did you see there's a question in the chat if someone could stay on with Rebby?